In 2022, a wedding that was meant to be the happiest day for a couple ended in tragedy. What should have been a celebration turned into a shocking event that no one in attendance would ever forget. On that fateful day, a secret was revealed, a secret that would lead to the death of one person and change the lives of everyone involved. Alora had kept her past hidden, but her husband, Caleb, chose their wedding day to expose her. What followed was a confrontation so intense that it led to violence, and by the end of the night, someone was dead. The story of this tragic wedding day would soon unravel in a way no one saw coming, as police began investigating what led to this brutal ending. Stay with us as we go through the details of a heartbreaking and deadly twist that forever changed the course of lives on what was supposed to be a day of love and joy. It was supposed to be the happiest day of Alora's life. The sun was shining, the guests had gathered, and everything seemed perfect. Alora, in her late 20s, was ready to start her new life with Caleb, the man she thought she would spend forever with. Dressed in her wedding gown, Alora stood in front of the altar, heart racing with excitement. Caleb, a handsome man in his early 30s, stood across from her, but something about his expression seemed off. Alora didn't notice it at first, but tension was building. The ceremony moved forward like any other wedding. The vows were exchanged, and the guests smiled at the sight of what appeared to be a picture-perfect couple. But just as they were about to seal their union, Caleb did something no one expected. He stopped. There was a long silence, and in front of all their family and friends, he exposed a secret Alora had kept hidden for years. Without warning, Caleb revealed that Alora had been assigned male at birth, a fact she had chosen to keep private throughout their relationship. The crowd gasped in disbelief. Alora's world fell apart in an instant. Her heart sank as she stood frozen, unable to move or speak. The man she loved, the one she had trusted with her heart, had betrayed her in the most public and painful way possible. The whispers in the crowd grew louder as people exchanged confused and shocked looks. Dana, Alora's best friend and maid of honor, rushed to her side, trying to console her, but the damage was done. The day that was meant to be full of joy and love had turned into a living nightmare. Caleb's face showed no remorse as he walked away from the altar, leaving Alora standing there, humiliated and heartbroken. Alora's secret, one she had held onto for so long, was now out in the open for everyone to judge. She had always planned to tell Caleb, but fear held her back. She didn't want to lose him, and now, because of his cruel decision, she had lost everything in the worst way imaginable. Dana took Alora by the arm and led her out of the venue, trying to shield her from the stares and whispers. The wedding was over, but the consequences were only just beginning. After the wedding, Alora went to stay with Dana, unable to face anyone else. She couldn't go back to the home she had shared with Caleb. Her mind raced with questions, trying to figure out why he had done this to her. She had loved him, trusted him, and now he had exposed her secret in front of everyone she knew. The pain was overwhelming, and she couldn't think of a way to move forward. A few days passed, and Alora remained at Dana's apartment, trying to process everything that had happened. She hadn't heard from Caleb since the wedding, and the silence only made things worse. But then, the news came. Caleb had been found dead in his apartment. He had been stabbed multiple times, and his body was discovered by a neighbor who had heard shouting the night before. The police were called, and the investigation began immediately. Detective Akil, a veteran investigator with years of experience in homicide cases, was assigned to the case. The first person they looked at was Alora. After all, she had the most obvious motive. Caleb had publicly humiliated her, and now he was dead. But things were not as clear-cut as they seemed. Alora was devastated when she heard about Caleb's death. She hadn't wanted anything like this to happen, despite the pain he had caused her. When the police came to question her, she was cooperative, telling them everything she knew about the wedding and their relationship. She admitted that Caleb's actions had hurt her deeply, but she insisted she had nothing to do with his murder. Dana, who had been with Alora the night of the murder, vouched for her friend, providing an alibi. She told the police that Alora had been with her the entire night, too emotionally wrecked to leave the apartment. The detectives took her statement, but they weren't ready to rule Alora out just yet. The circumstances were too suspicious, and they needed more information. As Detective Akil dug deeper into Caleb's life, he found that there were others who had reasons to want him dead. Caleb's family, who had been present at the wedding, had their own complicated history with him. His brother, known for his temper and history of violent behavior, had a rocky relationship with Caleb. The detectives also uncovered that Caleb had been involved in some questionable business dealings that could have made him enemies. The crime scene told a story of its own. Caleb's apartment showed signs of a struggle. Furniture was overturned, and there were signs that Caleb had fought back against his attacker. But there were no obvious clues, no fingerprints, no witnesses who could point to who might have done it. The police began piecing together a timeline of the events leading up to the murder, talking to neighbors and anyone who had seen or spoken to Caleb in the days following the wedding. Alora, now in the center of a murder investigation, struggled to cope with everything that was happening. She had lost the man she loved, been publicly shamed, and now found herself accused of a crime she hadn't committed. Her mind kept going back to that wedding day, wondering if things would have turned out differently if she had told Caleb the truth earlier. But there was no going back now. The secret was out, Caleb was dead, and her life had been turned upside down. As the investigation continued, Detective Akil began to see that this case was more complex than he initially thought. There were too many variables, too many people who could have had a reason to harm Caleb. Was it a crime of passion? A revenge killing? Or was there something deeper at play that no one had seen coming? The search for the truth was far from over. As the investigation progressed, Detective Akil found himself sifting through the fragments of Caleb's life, trying to make sense of the tangled web that surrounded his murder. The public exposure of Alora's secret had shocked everyone, but Akil wasn't convinced that this was just about a disgraced wedding. The crime scene had suggested a struggle, and the nature of Caleb's injuries indicated that his attacker was filled with rage. Akil knew that in cases like this, emotions were often the driving force behind the violence. While Alora remained the primary suspect in the public eye, Detective Akil wasn't so sure. Something about the timing of the murder and the way it was carried out seemed too chaotic to be a premeditated revenge plot. If Alora had wanted to kill Caleb in response to his actions at the wedding, wouldn't she have done so earlier? And why would she leave so many traces of a struggle? The questions piled up as Akil looked into other possibilities. Caleb's family became a focus of the investigation. His brother Adam was known for having a violent streak. People who knew the family often remarked on the tense relationship between the brothers. Adam had always been quick-tempered, and though he and Caleb had seemed close on the surface, there were deep-rooted issues that had never been addressed. Detective Akil paid Adam a visit at his home, where he found a man who seemed unaffected by his brother's death. Adam was calm, almost too calm, as if Caleb's murder hadn't left much of an impact on him. Akil questioned Adam about the night of the murder, but Adam's alibi was shaky. He claimed he had been at a friend's house that evening, but he couldn't remember details that might back up his story. His nonchalance raised red flags for Akil. When asked about his relationship with Caleb, Adam was dismissive, brushing off any suggestion of tension. But Akil could sense that something was off. He couldn't prove it yet, but he suspected that Adam knew more than he was letting on. At the same time, Akil dug deeper into Caleb's personal life. He soon discovered that Caleb had been involved in some shady business dealings that might have contributed to his death. Caleb had invested in a few risky ventures, including a partnership with a local real estate developer. Several of these deals had gone south, leaving Caleb in debt to some dangerous people. The more Akil uncovered, the clearer it became that Caleb had made enemies outside of his family. One name kept coming up in his investigation: Tony Russo, a known figure in the real estate business who had a reputation for getting what he wanted by any means necessary. Caleb had borrowed a significant amount of money from Tony to fund a project that ultimately failed. There had been arguments, threats, and rumors that Tony had warned Caleb about what would happen if he didn't pay up. Detective Akil knew that Tony was the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to use violence to settle a debt. Akil decided to pay Tony Russo a visit, but the meeting did little to clear things up. Tony was smug, his answers evasive, and he denied having any involvement in Caleb's murder. He claimed that Caleb still owed him money, but he had no reason to kill him. Killing Caleb wouldn't bring his money back, Tony argued, and he had other ways to get what he was owed. Akil left the meeting with more questions than answers, but Tony remained on his radar as a possible suspect. As the days passed, the tension in the investigation only grew. Alora, though heartbroken and grieving, remained at the center of public speculation. The media had picked up on the story, and soon enough, everyone was talking about the shocking wedding day revelation and the murder that followed. Alora found herself hounded by reporters, unable to leave Dana's apartment without facing a barrage of questions. It felt like her entire life had been turned into a spectacle, and there was no escape. Dana, meanwhile, remained Alora's constant source of support. She did her best to shield Alora from the chaos, but even Dana couldn't stop the tidal wave of gossip and speculation. Despite the pressure, Dana stood firm in her defense of Alora. She insisted to anyone who would listen that Alora couldn't have been involved in Caleb's death. But as much as Dana tried to help, even she couldn't shake the unease that had settled over their lives. Back at the police station, Detective Akil continued to piece together the puzzle. He looked into Caleb's phone records, financial transactions, and the people he had been in contact with leading up to his death. One thing became clear: Caleb had been in a lot more trouble than anyone realized. The debts, the failed business ventures, and his increasingly strained relationships with both family and business associates painted a picture of a man who was in over his head. But as much as Akil focused on Caleb's dealings, he couldn't ignore the emotional side of the case. Caleb's actions at the wedding had humiliated Alora in the most public way possible. Even if she hadn't committed the murder, there was no denying the emotional toll it had taken on her. Akil wondered if someone close to Alora might have taken matters into their own hands, seeking revenge on her behalf. The idea of Dana being involved in some way crossed his mind, but there was no evidence to support such a theory, at least not yet. The investigation seemed to stall for a moment as Akil waited for more forensic results to come in. Fingerprint analysis from Caleb's apartment had yielded nothing conclusive, and the lack of a murder weapon made it difficult to move forward. Still, Akil knew that the key to solving the case was somewhere in the details. Every person involved, from Caleb's family to his business partners, seemed to have a motive, but none of the pieces fit together perfectly. Then, a breakthrough came in the form of a witness. A neighbor, who had previously been too scared to come forward, finally approached the police with information. She had seen someone entering Caleb's apartment the night of the murder. At first, she had dismissed it as just another visitor, but after hearing about the murder, she realized that what she had witnessed might be important. The description she gave was vague: a man, dressed in dark clothing, entering the apartment late at night. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she remembered that he had been tall and had moved quickly, as if he was in a hurry. It wasn't much to go on, but it gave Detective Akil a new lead. He began revisiting the suspects, comparing the description to the people involved in Caleb's life. The investigation took a sharper turn as Akil began zeroing in on Adam once again. His story hadn't added up from the beginning, and the witness description matched Adam's height and build. Akil confronted Adam with the new information, pressing him harder than before. This time, Adam's calm demeanor cracked. He became defensive, denying any involvement but becoming increasingly agitated as the questioning continued. Akil wasn't convinced by Adam's denials. There was something in his behavior that suggested guilt, but without hard evidence, Akil couldn't make an arrest. Still, he kept Adam in his sights, knowing that the truth would eventually come out. The case continued to evolve, with new layers of complexity revealing themselves at every turn. Caleb's death had shattered more than just a family. It had exposed secrets, rivalries, and long-held grudges. Detective Akil knew that he was close to uncovering the truth, but with so many people hiding pieces of the puzzle, it would take more digging to get to the heart of what really happened that night. As Detective Akil delved deeper into the investigation, he could feel the tension tightening around the suspects. With Caleb's death now linked to several possible motives, from family disputes to business betrayals, the case had evolved into a twisted maze of secrets. Everyone seemed to have something to hide, but no one was willing to come forward with the full truth. Adam, Caleb's brother, remained at the forefront of Akil's suspicions. After the witness's vague description of the man seen entering Caleb's apartment, Akil knew that Adam's earlier shaky alibi was becoming more problematic. He wasn't ready to make any arrests without solid proof, but the pressure on Adam was building. Akil noticed that Adam had become increasingly defensive, often contradicting himself during questioning. One day, Akil called Adam back in for another round of interrogation. This time, Adam was visibly nervous, his calm demeanor cracking even more than before. Akil pressed him harder than ever, asking about his whereabouts on the night of the murder. Adam's story changed again, but he tried to cover it up by claiming he had been drinking and couldn't remember every detail. Akil didn't buy it. He knew Adam was hiding something that could blow the case wide open. Meanwhile, Alora was struggling to piece her life back together. The wedding day disaster still haunted her, and now Caleb's death had thrown her world into even deeper chaos. She had been cleared of direct involvement in the murder, but the cloud of suspicion still lingered. People whispered about her in the streets, wondering if she had somehow orchestrated the entire thing. No matter where she went, it felt like the eyes of the world were on her. Dana continued to stand by Alora's side, fiercely protective of her friend. Dana was Alora's rock in these turbulent times, always ready to defend her from the rumors and accusations. But even Dana was starting to feel the weight of the situation. She had noticed how withdrawn Alora had become since Caleb's death. There were moments when Alora seemed lost, distant, as if she was holding something back. Dana couldn't quite place it, but she felt that Alora might be hiding something even from her closest friend. Detective Akil had noticed this too. Alora, despite her grief and apparent innocence, seemed to be holding on to a secret. Her past, now exposed to the public, had made her vulnerable, and Akil wondered if there was more to her relationship with Caleb than anyone knew. He decided it was time to have another conversation with her, to see if she would open up about anything that might shed light on Caleb's murder. When Akil visited Alora at Dana's apartment, he found her looking tired and emotionally drained. She welcomed him in but remained guarded, her eyes betraying the turmoil she was feeling inside. Akil started gently, asking about her state of mind and how she had been coping since the wedding and Caleb's death. Alora responded with short answers, careful not to reveal too much. Akil noticed that she was hesitant to talk about her relationship with Caleb before the wedding. The more he asked about their time together, the more distant she became. It was clear to Akil that Alora was still grieving, but there was something else beneath the surface. He pressed her carefully, asking if there had been any problems between her and Caleb in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Alora paused for a moment before admitting that things hadn't been as perfect as they appeared. Caleb had become increasingly distant in the months before the wedding, and there had been arguments, small ones at first, but they had grown worse over time. She didn't know why, but Caleb had seemed troubled, as if something was weighing heavily on him. This revelation made Akil wonder if Caleb's actions at the wedding, the public exposure of Alora's secret, were part of something much bigger. What if Caleb had been dealing with more than just his feelings about Alora's past? What if someone had been influencing him, pushing him to create the chaos that ultimately led to his death? Akil decided to revisit Caleb's financial dealings, suspecting that the answers to his questions might lie there. With the help of his team, Akil uncovered a series of transactions that pointed to deeper problems in Caleb's life. It turned out that Caleb had been in significant financial trouble, far worse than anyone had realized. He had taken out loans from dangerous people, including Tony Russo, the shady real estate developer, who Akil had already questioned once. The money Caleb owed wasn't small, and it was clear that his failure to pay up had put him in a precarious position. Akil dug deeper into the connections between Caleb and Tony, discovering that Caleb had been desperately trying to find a way out of his debt in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Tony had pressured him, sending threatening messages that made it clear Caleb's time was running out. Akil knew that Tony Russo wasn't a man to be taken lightly. He was ruthless, and if Caleb had crossed him, there was no doubt that Tony would have taken matters into his own hands. But Tony had denied involvement in the murder, claiming that killing Caleb wouldn't solve anything. Akil had to decide whether Tony was telling the truth or simply covering his tracks. The mounting evidence against Tony was hard to ignore, but Akil didn't want to jump to conclusions without proof. While Akil was focusing on Tony Russo, another break in the case came from an unexpected source. A second witness, who had been hesitant to come forward earlier, finally reached out to the police. This witness claimed to have seen a heated argument between Caleb and Adam just days before the wedding. According to the witness, Adam had been furious with Caleb about something related to their family business, and the argument had nearly come to blows. This new information painted a clearer picture of the tension between the brothers. Akil realized that Adam's involvement might not be about the wedding at all. It could be tied to their family's financial troubles. Caleb's mounting debt had put the family's reputation at risk, and Adam, known for his temper, might have seen Caleb as a threat to their business and livelihood. With this new lead, Akil brought Adam back in for questioning. This time the conversation was different. Adam was more nervous, his story full of inconsistencies. When confronted with the witness's statement, Adam finally broke. He admitted to the argument but insisted that he hadn't meant for things to go so far. He claimed that he had only gone to Caleb's apartment on the night of the murder to talk things through. But when Caleb refused to listen, Adam lost control. He described a struggle, one that ended with him grabbing a knife in the heat of the moment. Adam's confession came with a mix of relief and regret. He hadn't planned to kill his brother, but the weight of their family's problems and the stress of Caleb's reckless behavior had pushed him over the edge. Detective Akil listened carefully, knowing that Adam's story, while tragic, finally gave him the answers he had been searching for. As Adam was taken into custody, the pieces of the case began to fall into place. Caleb's public humiliation of Elora, while devastating, had been only part of a much larger story. The financial strain, the family disputes, and the personal tensions had all contributed to the explosive confrontation that ended in murder. The truth, as it often does, had finally come to light. But for Elora, the resolution brought little comfort. She had lost the man she once loved, been exposed in front of the world, and now had to live with the knowledge that Caleb's death had been the result of a family feud that had spiraled out of control. With the investigation finally nearing its conclusion, Detective Akil returned to the crime scene, piecing together the details of what had really happened. Caleb's death wasn't just the result of a wedding gone wrong, it had been the climax of a series of events that had spiraled out of control. As Akil reviewed the evidence, it became clearer that multiple factors had led to Caleb's murder. Elora had been the center of attention since the wedding, but the deeper Akil dug, the more he realized there was more to Caleb's life than anyone had known. His financial troubles, shady business dealings, and the public exposure of Elora's past had all played a role in his downward spiral. Caleb's actions at the wedding had humiliated Elora, but the growing pressure in his life had been building for months. As Akil continued investigating, a new witness came forward with crucial information. The neighbor who had heard the argument at Caleb's apartment the night of his murder had seen someone entering and leaving the building just before the incident. The description given matched neither Elora nor Dana, but someone else close to Caleb. The key to solving the case, however, wasn't in the witness's statement, but in the final piece of evidence Akil uncovered a financial trail that led straight back to Caleb's deteriorating relationships with those around him. Eventually, Detective Akil pieced together the truth: Caleb's murder had been carried out by someone connected to his dangerous financial dealings. His growing debts, his arrogance, and his risky decisions had caught up with him. The exposure of Elora's secret had been the breaking point, but the forces that had been closing in on Caleb for months had finally pushed someone to take his life. Elora, despite her anguish, had no part in Caleb's death. She had been dragged through the mud, accused by the public, and humiliated on what should have been her happiest day, but in the end she had never sought revenge. The murder was an outcome of Caleb's own recklessness, entangled in shady business deals that had come back to haunt him. The killer, someone Caleb owed money to, had decided that the only way to settle the score was through violence. Detective Akil's persistence paid off, and the murderer was finally arrested, bringing the case to a close. For Elora, the revelation that Caleb's murder wasn't related to the wedding betrayal brought a mix of relief and sorrow. She hadn't wanted Caleb dead despite everything. There had been love between them once. But now, with the truth out in the open, she had to find a way to move forward. Dana remained her pillar of support, helping her navigate the emotional aftermath. Caleb's funeral was a small, quiet affair, attended only by a few close friends and family. The once proud man, whose life had spiraled so quickly into chaos, was laid to rest, but the scars he had left behind remained. Elora, although cleared of any involvement, was left to rebuild her life from the wreckage of the scandal. Her trust in people had been shattered, but she knew she had to start over. As the case officially closed, Detective Akil felt a weight lift. It had been a complicated, painful investigation, but justice had finally been served. He left the case knowing that Caleb's death had been the result of his own choices that had hurt many people along the way. The public spectacle of the wedding day had been the final spark, but the fire had been smoldering for far longer. Life slowly returned to a new normal. Elora moved forward, though the past still haunted her. Caleb's murder may have been solved, but the consequences of that fateful wedding day would be felt for years to come. In the end, the truth had come to light, but it was a truth that no one involved would ever forget.